he's not talking to Donny Cates. When Donny Cates was working at Marvel, Donny Cates is like the most fan servicey fucking comic creator that Marvel has produced in the last 10 years. Almost everything he did had something to do with the history of the character and building out on that. I'm sure by now everyone's heard this story, the guy from Comic Book Palace going out there. Someone clipped about 60 seconds off of a video from his YouTube channel, and it turns out he was an older white gentleman, maybe not the best looking guy in the room, so everyone thought they could dogpile on him, and apparently it's a new day in comic books, and everybody came to his defense, and we got a good old-fashioned, I don't know, comic book dance fight or something, where everyone was basically owning each other on Twitter and probably other social media platforms, but I only look at Twitter or whatever. It was pretty funny. I think a lot of people missed the point. I do think that Glen was absolutely speaking the God's honest truth, and that's why there was so much outcry, especially against him. But it turns out canceling may not be quite as in vogue as it was just a few years ago. And a lot of people just kind of shut those clowns down, which I do appreciate. And obviously, he was just on with Mark Miller a couple of days ago on his channel talking about his thoughts on comic books. And I thought he did a really good job and had a really good showing kind of explaining where he was coming from. But you've gotten a little too close to the truth, or maybe you've spoken the absolute truth when everyone has to talk about it. So I'll get into what he had to say, my thoughts on it, some examples to back up exactly what this guy's talking about. The three guys that really piled on him the most, Ramon Villalobos, Jamal Igle, and Donny Cates, and why he basically wasn't talking about any of them. And then a few examples that demonstrate that Glen obviously was speaking pretty plain English, because some people got exactly what he was saying. But this is the quote from the clip that launched 1,000 swords on Twitter and YouTube and all this stuff that's going on around Glen. Most of these new artists don't have the love of comics like the older writers had. All they care about is how can I put myself in the book. He says in the video, which has been viewed over 1 million times, the comic store owner adds, "No, we don't care what you would do if you were Iron Man. We don't get who you are. You are writing Tony Stark. You are not writing yourself in a book. If that's the case, write your own comic with you in it. Nobody will read it because nobody cares." People grew up loving Peter Parker, loving Miles Morales, loving all the Captain America. We don't need you to put yourself into it. Just write Steve Rogers. Don't write what would Steve Rogers be if I was Steve Rogers. That's not how it works. And that's pretty plain as day is what he's getting across, is there are too many writers who are forcing themselves into the stories and a lot of times overtaking the characters themselves. In fact, we have a ton of examples of just self-insert characters where writers will take a series with a hero that people know. They'll put themselves into the book and outshine the actual hero of the book. We've got so many examples of that going on right now. We've got Steve Orlando on the X-Men line. Have you ever read a book with Somnus in it? Somnus is who Steve Orlando would be if he was an X-Men and he had a mutant power. He's out there raping men like in their dreams for 100 years straight. That's what Steve Orlando apparently would do if he was a superhero. That's apparently what Steve Orlando would do if he was a superhero. If you've read Hawkgirl, the real star of that book is Galaxy, Jadzia Axelrod's like trans stand-in character that is absolutely the hero of the book. The book really isn't even about Hawkgirl. It's actually about Galaxy. And there are so many examples of this, and it's very pervasive. I've read most of Tom King's Batman. I've read all of his Strange Adventures. I've read all of his Heroes in Crisis. I've read a lot of Tom King comic books. I'm reading his Wonder Woman right now. After reading those comic books, I know more about Tom King than I know about Batman, Adam Strange, Wally West, any of the heroes in Heroes in Crisis, and certainly Wonder Woman, because Tom King forces himself into every comic book that he writes. It's only about what Tom King is feeling at the time. And there's nothing wrong with taking inspiration from real world events or how you're really feeling. That's a lot of times how you get your best stories. But you're not actually taking those events and seeing how the character would react. You're changing the character to how you would react. Another great example is Tom Taylor on Superman Son of Kal-El. Now, I don't believe Tom Taylor is actually gay. I believe he's married with kids and all that kind of stuff. But he had to make John Kent Superman gay. And the book was all about a coming-of-age love romance story between him and Jay Nakamura, where really the big villains they were fighting was like immigration and stuff like that. It was really, really boring. And guess what? You got a mainline Superman book canceled in 18 issues because there was no interest, because it wasn't a Superman book. It was a Tom Taylor book, much like what was going on in Titans before Beast World #1 came out this past week, where the Titans are planting trees instead of fighting villains. And fuck, I love Arbor Day. I really do, but I don't love Arbor Day so much that I want the premier superhero team in the DC Comics universe planting trees rather than going out there and fighting Doomsday or whoever was going on. And it's just overtaken it, and it's absolutely turned off a lot of longtime readers. And that does affect Glen and Comic Book Palace and a lot of other comic book retailers out there when there's a lack of interest. And the people that you can count on to show up every single Wednesday stop showing up because they're like, I haven't read a Captain America book about Captain America in a decade now. Every single writer on the book is just expressing their feelings about how they don't like what America is and America's past and what it stands for. So I'm going to take Captain America, the symbol of America in Marvel comic books, and use him as a vehicle to shit on America. It turns out fans of Captain America kind of like Captain America. Are we getting back to that with JMS? I'm not really sure. It's a little bit slow right now, but at least he's trying. But he's the first guy that's actually tried to tell a Captain America story in a Captain America comic book in well over a decade now. This dude is absolutely speaking the gospel truth, and that's why so many people ended up reacting to it, and he absolutely has a point, and he made it very well. This is what the person I thought piled on him the worst, in my opinion, Jamal Igle, had to say. Who is this lovely individual? He's going to be real shocked about how all comics are written and how writing in general works. His business is dying because he refuses to change with the times. He also added, there's a simple rule in sales: showing contempt for the product shows contempt for the customers. Don't do it. Sell everything like you love it. And then he finished, seriously, he reminds me of a few old guard guys. He used to run shops here in New York City from stores that smelled like stale cigarettes, mold, and urine. Unclean, sloppy stock. These guys either went out of business, died, or both. There used to be a shop called Comic Plus in Park Slope. The owner was a miserable old man. His incontinent mother spent every day smoking cigarettes in the store, smelling like urine. He had 2 employees in the years I went there and reluctantly carried indie books. Eternal works, and reluctantly carried indie books. His business is dying because he refuses to change with the times. What do you know about Glen and Comic Book Palace that tells you that he hasn't adapted to the times? Are you actually at his shop? Have you went and spoken to the man, or did you just see a 60-second clip of him on Twitter or whatever and decide that he smells like urine and his mother must be in the fucking corner smoking cigarettes like the guy at the shop that you don't like in New York City? Like, there's no ability to actually jump to these conclusions just off of what he said. I'm sure he is adapting with the times, and I'm sure he's seeing that the times are very difficult, much like Phil Boyle and Brian Hibbs and all the other comic book retailers out there saying, hey, there's something wrong with comics. Nobody wants to buy these stories anymore. And this dude is not fucking talking to Jamal Igle, who hasn't worked at DC in several fucking years. And when has he worked at Marvel? He hasn't done any mainstream comic book work in a very long time. The only thing he's done lately is The Wrong Earth from Ahoy Comic Books. I can tell you right now, if Ahoy went out of business or they decided to stop publishing The Wrong Earth comic books, illustrated by Jamal Igle, Glen and Comic Book Palace likely wouldn't even notice it. He's not talking about that bullshit. He's talking about mainstream comic books from Marvel and DC, where they go out there and they hire the worst writers imaginables. Your Jadzia Axelrods, your Charlie Jane Anders, your Steve Fox, your fucking Steve Orlandos, your Colin Kelly and Jackson Lanzigs, who are going in there and they're overtaking the character with their own personal agendas, and they're ruining the characters and the stories, and it's killing interest in mainstream comic books. No one gives a fuck if someone goes out there and puts a Jamal Igle stand-in in the fucking Wrong Earth, because no one reads it. He's not talking to you. There's nothing that Jamal Igle could do, good or bad, that could actually affect the business of Glen and Comic Book Palace and mostly any of the other comic book shops out there. This dude is talking about what Marvel and DC are doing, the people they're hiring, and the creators they're hiring going in there and fucking up all the primetime characters. That's what he's talking about. Yet these are the guys that went in and decided to dogpile on him because, well, he's an older white guy. He's balding a little bit. And apparently it looks like he's got salami breath because he's not a thin individual anymore. Although I saw pictures of him, when he was in his 40s, it looked like he was in pretty good shape. Shockingly, as you get older, your hair gets a little bit thinner. You put on a little bit of weight, and you're not quite as handsome as you used to be in some cases. Now, in the case of Jamal Igle, he used to be a very fat man, and I'm glad that he got himself in shape. Another very heavy-set man out there that hasn't gotten himself in shape is Ramon Villalobos. This is what he said. Comic writers, take note, the salami breath hog has some sage wisdom for all of you. A lot of people are dunking on this guy, but I think he's just never seen himself in a comic and how powerful that can be. If I made a comic with my own experiences as a fat, stupid, ugly piece of shit maybe then he would see the value of representation. What the fuck are you talking about? Glen never even talked about representation. That wasn't the point of his message at all. He was saying we have established mainstream characters that are popular. Peter Parker, Spider-Man. He talked about Miles Morales. He talked about Captain America. Characters that are actually important to people. And Marvel and DC are hiring writers going out of their way not to tell stories that make sense with the characters, or to tell stories that go against everything that the character is and break them whole cloth just because they want to make a point with the character or whatever. He's not even talking about representation. When did Glen say that representation was bad in comic books? He's only got fucking hundreds of hours of comic book commentary on his YouTube channel. Why don't you go check it out and see if he actually hates representation in comic books? Nobody hates representation in comic books. People hate representation for representation's sake, where everything's just a stereotype or a cookie cutter cutout of the same characters that already exist. If you can't create something new and interesting, what is the fucking point? If you can't create something that adds value to the universe or creates new stakes or a new obstacle for the hero to overcome, you haven't really created anything. I think that's what this guy is trying to say. No one's talking about representation, and Ramon is another person. This guy's not talking about Ramon Villalobos. Ramon hasn't done any mainstream comics like in forever. And when he did work at Marvel and DC, he never worked on a book that sold anything because he's Ramon Villalobos, and like he's not a bad artist. Like there's nothing wrong with his art, but he's not fucking great. He's not DC level. He's not Marvel level. You know, the last book that I can remember that he worked on was Border Town, which basically destroyed the entire Vertigo line. Destroyed all of it. We'll never get Vertigo again. Now, it's probably not Ramon's fault. It's actually, what was the name of the writer? Eric Esquivel? I think that's his name. But there certainly was a lot of self-inserts in that book. But at that point, who cares? It's fucking Border Town. It's not like he went out there and took an established character and decided to ruin that. He took himself and decided to ruin it himself. Like, who cares? But this guy isn't talking to Ramon Villalobos, but this is the guy out there calling him a fucking salami-breathed hog. It's like, Ramon, you're in your early 30s and you're already 350 pounds. When you make it to this guy's age, if you do, you're going to look awful. You're not going to have teeth left. You're going to be fucking bald. Like, you're going to have bags on your eyes. You're going to look like fucking Dan Slott, but probably worse, because I imagine Dan Slott was probably thinner than you when he was your age. Like, come on, man. The pot calling the kettle black shit is just stupid in this case because, like, you're fatter than that guy. And that guy's in his 50s or 60s. Like, get out of here, man. And then the last person that did pile on him, that maybe he, in theory, he could have been talking to, but he certainly isn't, was Donny Cates, who said, don't you guys hate when you go into a hardware store, how the guy behind the counter always tells you how much the hammers suck? And then he deleted that and came back and said something kind of normal and then lost it again. And like, he's not talking to Donny Cates. When Donny Cates was working at Marvel, Donny Cates is like the most fan servicey fucking comic creator that Marvel has produced in the last 10 years. Almost everything he did had something to do with the history of the character and building out on that. That's actually what people were looking for. That's why Donny Cates was one of the few A-list creators in comic books. It didn't matter what character you put Donny on at Marvel. It would fucking sell because they knew he was going to take something with the character and have some fun with it. Maybe it wouldn't work every time, but you at least knew it would make sense for the character, or at least the past of the character. And that's what the guy is actually looking for. He's not talking shit on Donny Cates and like this. Don't you love it when you go to a hardware store and the guy behind the counter tells you how much the hammers suck? I would hate to go to a hardware store and say, hey, listen, this is what I need for the job I'm doing. And for them, and for the guy behind the counter to say, yeah, this is the hammer that you want because I've got to support everything. And it turned out it broke on the first swing because it's not the hammer that I needed, because he didn't take in my personal taste or my personal circumstance into the situation. That's Glen's fucking job. What is he supposed to do? Yeah, you should read America Chavez. It's fucking great knowing that the person is probably going to fucking hate it sight unseen. Is he supposed to be out there pushing fucking Hawkgirl or Fire and Ice or any of the other bullshit going on right now? What is he supposed to lie to his customers and destroy his relationship that he's worked 30 years to develop with them? Like, get out of here, man. You go to the guy at the hardware store because he's a fucking expert. He's going to point you in the direction of the thing that you want or need. Hopefully you think you need and also, you know, fulfills your needs, and it's within your price range and all that stuff. That's his job as a fucking retailer. And quite frankly, there's too much garbage out there right now. You know, Donny's not really working for Marvel or DC, but, you know, he did throw himself into a book recently. What is it called? Vanish or whatever? But it's literally just like Donny Cates all drugged out or whatever. And I don't know, Donny, instead of going out there and piling on some dude that's trying to keep his business alive, maybe you should get your fucking life in order, because it sounds like it sucks right now. It sounds like you're plenty fucked up and you got plenty of stuff to fix yourself before you go out there and try and dunk on the chuds or whatever it is that you were trying to do there. There were a couple of people besides Mark Miller that absolutely went out there, and you could tell that apparently Glen was communicating well, because this is what Jimmy Palmiotti said in a now deleted tweet. It is something I tell newer writers all the time. Read all the history of the character and understand their motivations and why the audience fell in love with them. It will help you understand who they are. So if you change anything about them, it's in line with who they are. That's absolutely amazing advice from Jimmy Palmiotti, and absolutely in line with what Glen was actually saying. He wasn't talking about representation. He wasn't talking about indie books. He's talking about Marvel and DC established characters where people go out of their way to fuck them up. I'm sure he's not happy about what Sophie Campbell was doing with TMNT, with her fucking self-insert with Jenica or whatever that they threw in there and destroy that series as well. These things are important. They're the tent poles. They're what bring people in. If you're going to be writing a Flash comic book, if it's going to be Barry Allen, read the Barry Allen stories. If it's going to be Wally West, you better read the Wally West stories. And if you want to bring Wally West in, for a cameo appearance, you better be familiar with the character so it makes sense and you're able to tell stories that actually fit the character and expand on the lore and people will actually love. That's the job of the writer. You are not artistes. You are commercial artists. You are writing things to a mass audience with 80 years of history behind them in a lot of cases. Jimmy Palmiotti fucking got it perfectly fine, but apparently Jamal Igle and Ramon Villalobos and Donny Cates have no fucking audible comprehension where they can't understand when people are talking. I will give a tip of the cap, especially to Gail Simone, who could have sat on the sidelines or even jumped in and piled on this guy. She said, "This is a tiny clip from a much longer video. This gentleman has had his store for 30 years. My hat is off to him, and I have watched his videos, and they are good fun." That's right. He's actually got his own YouTube channel. He's got a lot of content out there. If you really want to know what this guy thinks, go out and watch. Don't make your entire assumptions about him and how he feels about comic books based on a 60-second clip when he's got hundreds of hours of commentary available about his experience as a retailer and trying to sell modern comic books these days, because it's fucking hard. It's a thankless job, and Marvel and DC and a lot of creators are going out of their way to make it very fucking hard on people like Glen and other comic book retailers out there. And he was speaking very honestly, and he was speaking very clearly about one of the things that is plaguing comic books today. If you need an example, go read Hawkgirl. Actually, don't go read Hawkgirl. Watch this review I did of Hawkgirl, where we talk about Galaxy and Hawkgirl and how this is really a Jadzia Axelrod story rather than a Hawkgirl story. There's also a link in the video description.